Good morning, or good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. In this first lecture, we are going to be looking at an overview of the criminal justice system, looking at what are the major parts, how does it operate, basically just an overview. Please follow along on your own computers with the PowerPoint as we go through the lecture. So it's important to delineate the difference between criminology and criminal justice. Criminology is the academic study of crime, why it happens. Criminal justice is the study of the in-field practice, the system itself, the components that make it up. Criminology is sort of a second-generation scientific discipline coming as a sort of derivative of psychology, sociology, anthropology. And criminology has been around for about 80 years now. The criminal justice system is as old in the United States as the government itself. We'll look at a little later in future lectures about the history of the individual parts around the world and where our system comes from. But the criminal justice system itself is as old as the United States government. Okay. So we're going to start to look at some of the historical time periods and major events. So the system itself is a system of formal social controls. For the most part, the system, the police, the courts, are a very formal system where paperwork is filed, records are kept about things like that. But there has been a push more recently, especially in light of some of the recent facts that have been taking place, to actually have more informal controls, more things happening informally, not having records, just handling things as the police or whoever is encountering them see fit in the immediate area, not having to bring the formalities of the court. Typically, informal controls are better, they're cheaper, and when they can be used, it is preferable generally to use informal controls instead of the formal controls. In the past, the police have really been a formal control and have only been used when other informal controls aren't there. So when there isn't familial controls in the family, people controlling their behavior because they're involved in other community activities, religion, community outreach, where they're employed, things like that. So it's best if those things can be used to control people's behavior. But if it can't, that's when we have to rely on the formal criminal justice system. Although, like I said, there is a push to increase the informality of that system. So the system operates under two sort of principles: crime control versus due process. And we'll talk about some of the principles of those here in just a second. Due process basically means making sure that the government does everything in the exact proper order to maintain the rights of the accused. It holds the government to the highest the highest standard of the beyond reasonable doubt. Tries to make it so that the police have to have everything in order, that anything that is improper in the way evidence is collected, way that warrants are issued, will result in negative consequences toward the state's case. People don't really get let out on technicalities. That doesn't really happen. There's not, because someone didn't file a piece of paperwork on time, isn't going to result in a killer getting set free, as the movies would have you believe. But it is the belief that the rules and checks that are in place are there for a reason. The other side of the coin, the other way that the system operates is the crime control model, where the police try to arrest as many people as possible and then charge them with as many crimes as possible so that they can later have those charges pled down. It's the way that the war on drugs has been fought for the last 40 years, and it has really contributed heavily to a lot of the animosity that is currently being exhibited between the communities and the police. Things like 3 strikes laws, mandatory minimums are all part of a crime control system, where again you're trying to use the most formal aspects of the system to really control people's behavior. Very much at odds with the due process model, which is going to take a long time for one case to go through the system. It could take years for a felony case to go through the court system, and that's really counter to the crime control system, which tries to get people through as quickly as possible, have them plead guilty as quickly as possible, so that they can then process the next person coming down the line. It's important to note in the criminal justice system some of the practicalities of the system. One of them is that there are 2 types of guilt. The first is factual guilt, so what happened, who done it. The second is legal guilt, which is basically what can you prove in a court of law. Sometimes they're the same thing, sometimes they're not. Because as we'll learn a little later in the court section, there are only certain things that can be admitted into a court proceeding. Certain things are deemed to be irrelevant. Certain evidence may have not been collected improperly. If a suspect has a coerced confession, the police basically beat the shit out of a suspect. You can't use that confession. It's coerced, so that's where you would have a break potentially between what you could prove and what actually happened. So just sort of think about this. What system do you think we operate under today? And if you were a criminal facing charges, serious charges, which I'm sure none of us have ever faced, which system would you like the system to be operating under? Feel free to pause and contemplate this for a minute in your watching of the video. So we also break crime down into large groups as well. Basically 2 types of crimes. Crime either as a sin, natural law, or crime as a human construct, and things that we determine are bad, either based on the will of the people or the will of powerful people. So the first type, crime as a natural law. Think about an old story. So we've just, as a group, come from wandering out of the desert for 40 years, and now we're going to have this new society. So we have these commandments to live by. Why, in that situation, is murder bad? Think about it for a minute. Why is it bad? Why is, in a very small civilization, why is murder one of those things that we just shouldn't have? Some people are going to think that everyone has the right to live. That's right. That we shouldn't kill other people for other sort of moralistic reasons. The real thing is, in a small society, if you murder someone, that's one less person in our society. So if you kill the baker, now there's no one to make bread. Or if you kill the blacksmith, there's no one there to work metal. It's a similar thing with theft. People have the right to their own property. There are, again, moral issues and reasons, arguments why not to commit theft. But the real reason not to commit theft is you steal from people, then people aren't going to trust anyone. If you've ever had your car broken into, you come up to it, you see the window smashed, you see your belongings have been rambled through, it makes you distrustful. And then for the next 6 months, every time you go back to your car, you're looking on the floor, on the ground, is there glass? Is it broken into? Because you've had your illusion of safety shattered. The other type of crime is a human construct. So things that we decide are bad, drug crimes, sports gambling until recently, but they repealed a law at the federal level making it legal for states to allow sports betting in all 50 states if they so choose to. Prohibition of alcohol. Well, we're starting to see the laws about marijuana change, and that's based on a consensus opinion. The majority of people feel that these behaviors aren't appropriate, so we have laws prohibiting them, or in some cases removing prohibitive laws. The other side is conflict, where you have a small subset of the population that doesn't want a group of people participating in a behavior, so they make it illegal. That would be what happened in alcohol prohibition. It wasn't that a majority of the United States wanted to stop drinking. It was that a lot of powerful people, people that had political agency, forced a amendment to the Constitution. So consensus versus conflict. So crime is a legal construct. There are 7 elements that have to be present in the majority of crimes for it to be considered a legal offense. The first, there has to be a legally defined harm. Next, it has to be legally codified, this act, the harm. In Georgia, we have what's called the Official Code of Georgia Anointed, which is a collection of all the laws. You can go online and search for that and look up various types of offenses. If you're bored at a party, you can pull it up on your phone and show people the legal definitions of crimes in Georgia. You have to have the Guilty Act, which is again defined in the legal definition of the crime. And then you have the mens rea, which is the guilty mind. So you have to understand what you're doing is a crime and why it's a crime. That's an important component when we talk about culpability later. There has to be causation. So the act has to have caused the harm. It has to have concurrent, so it has to be a relatively unbroken chain of events. If there are other things that interfere with that, then that can affect at what level individuals are culpable for particular offenses. Then also in the legally defined definition, you're going to have a set punishment, where this crime equates to this many years or this particular sentence of life or execution in some cases. All that has to be very clearly defined in the legal code. It's important to note when you're trying to conduct research or look at study phenomenon in crime and criminology, more so than in other disciplines, particularly because public works are typically on a pretty thin budget. So you want to try to get as much coverage, as much impact as possible with limited resources. And we're seeing that become even more limited now with the push to shift funding in local governments away from police activities and towards more community outreach programs, which is a very good idea. We're going to have to sort of figure out what type of process we're going to do to invoke that. And it says my battery is still running low, so give me just a moment and I will try to fix this again. We are back up and running. So it's very important to make sure that you're directing your information to where it can do the most good, have the most impact. Whether you're trying to target police executives, police line officers, district attorneys, correctional officers, wardens, social workers, even criminals themselves. It's very important to construct your research and direct it towards a very targeted audience. Randomized experiments are difficult to conduct in criminal justice. It's very hard to create those conditions in a lab setting. So a lot of times, criminal justice research has to be samples of convenience. We have to go to places where we know crime is likely to take place and observe things happening there. You have to look for the whole process of what's happening here, of what other societal constructs, what other agencies, organizations might be involved. Even something like if you were studying runaway youths in New Orleans right before Hurricane Katrina, you would have a pretty large intervening factor happening there. If you were studying police operations in communities and working with communities and community policing this week or last week, your goal and your maybe your whole activities might change. You also have to have a reasonable measure of success because we're looking at a scenario where we have high recidivism rates, we have high reoffending rates. The bar of success can't be eradication of crime. We're looking at harm reduction here. We're looking at ways to improve on where we're at. And where we're at right now, honestly, is kind of shitty. And that's evident in the things that we're seeing happening in the streets right now. If you're watching this video for a future semester past summer 2020, it might not be as relevant. Hopefully, we fix the problems, but for us right now, it's rough. Also, again, with all these things, making sure that you target your audience, making sure that you have reasonable measures of success, that you've tried to control as much for intervening factors, it has to be cost effective. So it has to be able to be implemented. If we are able to prevent all crime in the world, but it costs $1 million per crime, there's a lot of crime happening. So it has to be something that can be implemented into public works. And that's always, unfortunately, a consideration when we're looking at policing and most other public works is the cost effectiveness of it. So this is just a kind of breakdown, sort of the scope of the system. State and federal system costs us about $200 billion a year. There are over 1 million people employed just in police and law enforcement, another 500,000 in correctional institutions. That's not even talking about how many people are attorneys, judges, people that work in courtrooms, other criminal justice individuals. So there's a lot of people in the United States that work in this industry, in this service. But it's not a service industry. It's kind of a service industry. We have over 7 million people under some form of correctional supervision. About 2 million of that is incarcerated in jails and prisons. About another 500,000 on parole. That's early release from incarceration, and the rest are on probation. On the low side, it costs about $30,000 per inmate. Again, that's on the low side. In most places, it's probably $40,000 to $60,000 an inmate, more for juveniles, inmates with special needs, elders with medical care, keeping individuals in isolation. It gets very, very expensive. So when we're trying to change the system, we're really trying to do two things. Changing who is in the system, education and training. This has been a focus on the police defunding campaigns that have happened, or disbanding campaigns that have happened in the past. Camden, New Jersey, for instance, basically got rid of their entire police force. And what they did was they let all the officers then reapply for their jobs. So the ones that were qualified were rehired. The ones that were not were let go. So it really was a very intense internal audit. And that's something that could be looked at going forward as a way to address some of the concerns of the communities. Number two is changing who the system processes. So changing what crimes we're charging. This is something that has been done in Atlanta specifically. A few years ago, they changed the city um, code for marijuana possession from a misdemeanor, which was punishable by up to $1,000 fine and a year in jail, to an ordinance violation, which is basically a $150, $75 ticket. So instead of getting an actual criminal charge, you're basically paying a ticket akin to a seatbelt violation or jaywalking. The reason they did this was because they looked at the numbers, and for the arrests in the city of Atlanta jail, 93% of the people brought in for marijuana possession were African American males. That is not the demographic makeup of the marijuana using population in the city of Atlanta. So there was a particular racial group that was being vastly overrepresented in the arrest population. So they changed who the system was processes. They changed they changed the rules of the system to have a better outcome. And that kind of sounds like cheating, but that's really what we should be doing. There's not any sort of just because we change a law and say that something that used to be prohibited is not prohibited, it doesn't have to reduce the legitimacy of the police. It can, learning from your mistakes can actually be a sort of bonding opportunity between those communities. It was kind of a funny Saturday Night Live video where the same thing happened in New York a few years before this, where they basically made it a ticketable violation, and all of the pot smokers come out of their houses, into this utopian new day, and they're smoking the weed, and the police officers come up, and there's expecting to be this sort of confrontation, and it's really not. It's kind of that mentality that we can just go forward. We don't have to just keep um, revisiting, rehashing, ripping the scabs off of the past. At some point, we need to just figure out a better way and then move forward with that.